After my most recent breakup, I had no choice but to move back in with my family. My ex and I had been living together in an apartment in Boston, but let me give you some advice. Never sign a lease with someone you've just started dating. He turned out to be someone completely different from who I thought he was. My parents live in Western Massachusetts, and if you know anything about this state, you know the further west you go, the more rural it gets. I'm definitely not a country girl. I prefer being in or near a big city, especially since I'm still in my 20s. Living here feels boring, but I'm hoping this is only temporary until I can afford my own place again. Boston, though, is off the table for personal reasons. In the meantime, I've gone back to working at the urgent care facility where I used to work before I moved. They welcomed me back with open arms, even if it's just for now. The downside is that I work night shifts, easy but dull, and they completely mess up my sleep schedule and social life. Not that there's much of a social scene around here anyway. After my shift one morning, I decided to grab what I call dinner at 4:30 a.m. Usually I get takeout since not much else is open. That morning I stopped at a bagel place that had just opened. They serve all kinds of food, so I got a chicken sandwich and a salad. On my way home, I needed to get gas, so I stopped at the local Shell station. It has a huge, mostly empty parking lot, even during the day. I went inside to pay cash, then returned to the pump. As I started fueling, another car, a blue sedan, pulled up. The driver got out, locked the pump to autofill, and walked over to me. "Want to see a funny trick?" he asked. I immediately regretted engaging, but, for some reason, replied, "What's the trick?" He began doing that ridiculous old detached finger trick, folding one finger down and pretending it was coming off. He kept glancing between his hands and me with this weird, sarcastic expression. I fake laughed, hoping he'd go away, but he didn't. He kept at it even when I turned away and tried to ignore him. When my tank finally clicked full, I was relieved. I quickly returned the nozzle, went inside to get my change, and came back out to see the man's car still there, his pump still running, but no sign of him. I didn't stick around to investigate. Out of paranoia, I checked my back seat to make sure he wasn't hiding there, locked my doors, and drove home. It was a quick 5-minute drive, and I was eager to eat my dinner. Using the spare key hidden outside, I unlocked the door, placed the key back in its hiding spot, locked the door behind me, and quietly headed to the kitchen so I wouldn't wake my parents. As I sat at the table eating, I heard the front door unlock and open. My heart froze. With my mouth full, I called out, "Mom? Dad?" but got no reply. I didn't hear any footsteps, just silence. Terrified, I ran upstairs and burst into my parents' bedroom, waking them up. "Someone just came inside," I whispered frantically. My dad leaped out of bed and we all went downstairs. He turned on every light as he checked the house, eventually discovering that the spare key was missing. My mom scolded me for not being more careful, but I was too scared to argue. My dad continued searching, room by room. When he checked my older brother's room, he moved on, but I stayed behind to double-check the spots he might have missed. Finding nothing, I cautiously went back downstairs. I didn't want to go into the basement, even with my dad down there, so I stayed on the main floor with my mom. Something told me to check the dining room. I got on my knees and looked under the table, and there he was, the man from the gas station. I screamed at the top of my lungs. My mom, hearing my panic, screamed too. My dad came running upstairs, ready to fight. The man crawled out from under the table and a struggle broke out. My dad, despite being in his 60s, held his own while my mom and I joined in, hitting and punching the man. Finally, overwhelmed, he fled through the front door. We called the police immediately and, thankfully, they arrived quickly. However, the man still had the stolen spare key. That night, a patrol car stayed parked in our driveway, and my dad barricaded the door with a chair before sleeping in the living room. The next day, we changed the locks and vowed never to leave a key outside again. Looking back, I feel guilty for being careless and bringing that man to my parents' home. I'm grateful we're all safe, but this experience has only strengthened my resolve to move out as soon as possible. I prefer driving at night because there's nothing I dislike more than being stuck in traffic. I'm from Long Island, New York, and the traffic here is absolutely unbearable. My brother lives in Florida, and I visit him pretty often, but the drive is long. Depending on when you leave, it can take up to 18 hours. Personally, I like to leave New York around 2 a.m. to avoid the usual heavy traffic. By then, most of the morning rush is already behind me. So, on a Thursday morning at 2 a.m., I hit the road. I stopped for coffee at Dunkin' Donuts, knowing I had a grueling drive ahead of me. The reason I was driving and not flying was that I was planning to stay in Florida for a month, and I didn't want to rely on my brother to get me everywhere I needed to go. By the time I left Long Island, it was already after 3 a.m., but once I was out of New York, it was smooth sailing. The drive down the I-95 is pretty straightforward. Around 4 a.m., though, I started getting hungry, so I pulled off the highway as soon as I saw a food sign. Wendy's caught my eye, so I decided to grab breakfast there. I skipped breakfast earlier because I usually don't feel hungry right away when I wake up so early. I followed the signs to Wendy's, and suddenly, I found myself in some random part of Jersey. No streetlights, just the dim glow from my headlights. It felt like I was in the middle of nowhere. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw a car there, so I thought the place was open. The menu board lit up, but after waiting for a minute, no one greeted me at the drive-thru. I even said hello to the speaker, but nothing. I pulled out my phone to check the hours, and I was surprised to see it didn't open until 6 a.m. Then, out of nowhere, there were 3 loud knocks on my window that nearly made me jump out of my seat. I turned to see a man standing outside, grinning at me. He gestured for me to roll down the window, but I didn't feel comfortable doing that, so I cracked it open just enough to hear him. He told me the restaurant was closed and said his car had broken down. He pointed to the only other car in the parking lot, explaining that his battery had died. He asked if I could help him jump-start it. I told him I didn't have jumper cables, but he assured me he had a set in his trunk. I hesitated for a moment, but I believe in karma, and I didn't want to leave him stranded when I could help. He backed up so I could park next to his car. After popping the hoods, we connected the cables, and I started my car to give it some time to charge his battery. After a minute, I told him to try starting his car. He walked inside the vehicle slowly, but when he tried to start it, nothing happened. We waited a little longer, and then he tried again, but still no luck. This was strange because the car had just been running, so the battery shouldn't have been drained like this. He then made a call in Spanish, speaking quietly. I didn't understand what he was saying, but when he came back, he told me his friend advised us to wait a few more minutes before trying again. I agreed, although I was growing impatient. But just as I was about to leave, I heard the roar of 2 trucks speeding toward us from opposite sides of the building. I instantly realized what was happening and muttered to myself in dread. I quickly began disconnecting the jumper cables and slammed my hood shut, but it was too late. The trucks had already pulled up behind me, trapping me in the parking lot. I had to act fast. The man was still smiling, but now his smile felt cold and sinister. I locked my car with the key fob and made a run for it, darting into the woods in the pitch-black darkness. My legs scraped against branches, and I tripped over something in the brush. At that point, I dropped to the ground, trying to make myself as small as possible. I could hear a few men yelling in Spanish nearby, and I was terrified. I didn't know how many of them there were or if they were armed, but I heard at least 3 voices. The sounds of their footsteps drew closer, and I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. Then, just as suddenly, the voices began to fade. I waited in silence, allowing myself to relax slightly, until I heard my car alarm go off in the distance. Panic surged through me. My car was left behind with everything I had packed: clothes, shoes, watches, and more. I cautiously made my way back to the parking lot, staying low. When I peeked around the corner, I saw that my car was still there, but the other vehicles were gone. I ran to my car, heart pounding, only to find my worst nightmare. My rear window had been shattered, and everything in my car was gone. My suitcase, all my bags, nearly 80% of my wardrobe, stolen. Overcome with stress and frustration, I burst into tears. I called the police, explained everything, and they told me they'd try to get the security footage from the Wendy's. The officer said they would be in touch, but I knew it was a long shot. I was about 2 hours from home, so I turned around and drove back. It was the most grueling, depressing drive I've ever had. A few days later, the police contacted me and informed me that the car in the Wendy's parking lot had a fake license plate, and the 2 trucks didn't have plates at all. They said they'd keep working on the case, but I knew it was unlikely they'd find anything. My stuff was gone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that those people had gotten away with it. As much as I believe in karma, I just hope those thieves eventually got what they deserved.